I still remember the first night I heard the piano. It was a Tuesday in late September, and I had just moved into my new apartment in the city. The building was one of those pre-war structures with high ceilings and surprisingly thick walls, or so the landlord had claimed. "You'll barely hear your neighbors," he'd said with a confident smile during the showing. Well, he was right about most sounds. Conversations, television shows, and even the occasional argument were all muffled to the point of being indistinguishable. But music? Music found a way to travel through whatever magical channels existed between apartments 3B and 3C. I was unpacking my collection of well-worn paperbacks when the first notes drifted through the wall, tentative at first, like someone testing the waters before diving in. A simple melody in C major, nothing fancy, but played with such delicate precision that I found myself pausing. A dog-eared copy of The Price of Salt, suspended midair between box and bookshelf. The melody repeated, gained confidence, and then suddenly blossomed into something complex and beautiful that I couldn't identify, but that made me set the book down entirely. For nearly an hour, I sat on my still sheetless mattress, listening as the unseen pianist worked through what seemed to be a practice session. There were stops and starts, repeated phrases, occasional frustrated-sounding chords when something didn't come out right. It was like being given accidental access to someone's most private moments, the musical equivalent of watching someone talk to themselves in the mirror. I felt both intrusive and privileged. That night, I fell asleep to Chopin. At least, I think it was Chopin. My musical knowledge was limited to what I'd picked up from film soundtracks and the classical music appreciation course I'd taken in college to fulfill an arts requirement. Whatever it was soothing, melancholic in parts, but ultimately hopeful, like a conversation with an old friend after years of separation. I dreamed of rain-slicked streets and amber streetlights. Over the next few weeks, the piano became the soundtrack to my evenings. My mysterious neighbor seemed to prefer playing after 9, when the building settled into its nighttime rhythm. I began to structure my routine around these impromptu concerts, washing dishes during scales and exercises, reading during the more melodic pieces, and often just sitting by the wall we shared, eyes closed. During what I came to recognize as favorites in the Pianist repertoire, I didn't mind the late-night serenades. In fact, I looked forward to them. Having recently moved to the city for a job that hadn't quite lived up to its promises, I was lonely in that particular way one can only be when surrounded by millions of people who don't know you exist. The music made me feel less alone, as if I had been personally invited into someone's world, even if they didn't know I was there. I began to create a mental image of my musical neighbor. Based on the selection of music, mostly classical with occasional forays into what sounded like jazz improvisations, I imagined an older gentleman, perhaps a retired music teacher or a professional musician still keeping his skills sharp. I pictured white hair, reading glasses perched on the end of a nose, fingers gnarled but still nimble on the keys. It was a comforting image, like having a benevolent grandfather figure watching over the building through his music. The reality, when I finally encountered it, was startlingly different. It happened on a Saturday morning at the local coffee shop around the corner from our building. I was standing in line, scrolling mindlessly through my phone, when someone behind me said, "Excuse me, but do you live in the Westerly on the 3rd floor?" The voice was younger than I expected, with a slight accent I couldn't place. I turned around and found myself face to face with a man who couldn't have been more than 30. He had dark hair that fell across his forehead in a way that seemed both careless and deliberate, warm brown eyes behind tortoiseshell glasses, and a hesitant smile that suggested he wasn't entirely sure he should be speaking to me. "Yes, 3B, I replied, suddenly conscious of my weekend attire, sweatpants, and a faded t-shirt from a brewery back home. "I'm in 3C, he said, extending his hand. "I think we share a wall. I'm Eli." Eli. The pianist had a name now, and a face, and a hand that I was shaking, warm and firm with calluses on the fingertips that I immediately attributed to hours at the piano. "I'm Marcus," I said, feeling a strange flutter in my chest that I attributed to the surprise of this encounter. "Nice to finally meet you. I hear you play sometimes." His smile faltered slightly. "I hope it's not too much. I try to keep it reasonable, but I'm preparing for an audition, and sometimes I lose track of time." No, I assured him quickly. "It's beautiful. I actually look forward to it." "What's the audition for, if you don't mind me asking?" The barista called for the next customer, saving Eli from having to answer immediately. We both ordered an Americano for him, a latte for me, and then, to my surprise, he asked if I wanted to share a table. The coffee shop was busy, tables at a premium, so it made practical sense. But there was something in the way he asked, a mixture of politeness and genuine interest, that made me think he might have been curious about me too. Over coffee, I learned that Eli was auditioning for a prestigious chamber music ensemble that would tour internationally. He had moved to the city 6 months earlier specifically to study with a renowned pianist who was known for helping musicians prepare for such opportunities. He spoke about music with a passion that transformed his entire demeanor, his hands gesturing expressively, his eyes brightening, his words coming faster as he described the pieces he was working on. "I'm sorry," he said after a particularly enthusiastic explanation of why Rachmaninoff's Third Piano Concerto was both brilliant and nearly impossible to play perfectly. "I don't get to talk about this stuff much outside of lessons. My friends are sick of hearing about it." "I don't mind," I said truthfully. "It's nice to hear someone talk about something they love." Our coffee stretched into lunch, and by the time we parted ways that afternoon, I had a completely different understanding of the music that had been filtering through my walls. It wasn't just practice or performance, it was Eli's voice, his dreams, his frustrations and triumphs translated into sound. After that day, we began to acknowledge each other with more than just neighborly nods when we passed in the hallway. Sometimes Eli would mention a particularly difficult passage he was working on, and I would confess that I had heard him struggling with it the night before. He seemed both embarrassed and pleased by this, as if my inadvertent eavesdropping validated his efforts somehow. "You should come over sometime," he said one evening as we rode the elevator together. "You know, to hear it properly instead of through the wall." I agreed immediately, perhaps too eagerly, but Eli didn't seem to notice. We set a date for the following week, and I spent the intervening days in a state of anticipation that seemed disproportionate to the event. It was just a neighbor playing piano, after all. Not a date. Definitely not a date. The night of the impromptu concert arrived, and I found myself standing outside Eli's door with a bottle of wine I had spent too much time selecting. When he opened the door, I was struck by how different his apartment was from mine, despite having the same layout. Where mine was still sparse, with moving boxes serving as makeshift end tables in some corners, Eli's was fully realized, bookshelves lined with scores and novels, walls adorned with framed concert programs and what looked like family photos. And dominating the living room, a beautiful upright piano that looked far too grand for the modest space. "It's not a Steinway," Eli said, following my gaze to the instrument, "but it has good tone, and the building hasn't complained yet, so." He shrugged, taking the wine from me with a grateful nod. "Make yourself comfortable. Would you like a glass before I play?" We shared the wine and conversation, sitting on his comfortable if slightly worn sofa. The apartment was warm in a way that went beyond temperature. It felt lived in, loved, a true reflection of its occupant. I found myself relaxing, the initial awkwardness of being in a near stranger's space melting away as Eli told stories about his musical journey from childhood lessons to conservatory to his current pursuit. When he finally moved to the piano, I felt a shift in the atmosphere. The casual, friendly Eli transformed as he sat on the bench, his posture straightening, his expression becoming more focused. He flexed his fingers, placed them on the keys, and then looked over at me with a smile that held a hint of vulnerability. "Any requests?" he asked. "Whatever you're working on for the audition," I suggested. "I'd love to hear it as it's meant to be heard." He nodded, took a deep breath, and began to play. The difference between hearing the music through the wall and experiencing it in the same room was profound. It wasn't just clearer or louder, it was alive in a way I hadn't anticipated. I could see the physical effort behind each note, the way Eli's body seemed to channel the music rather than simply produce it. His face reflected every emotional nuance of the piece, from intense concentration during complex passages to an almost transcendent expression during the more lyrical moments. I was transfixed. The piece, which he later told me was a Beethoven sonata, lasted about 15 minutes, but it felt both momentary and eternal. When the final notes faded, there was a silence that seemed too profound to break with something as mundane as applause. Instead, I found myself exhaling a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. That was. I struggled to find words adequate to the experience. I've never heard anything like that before. Eli's cheeks flushed slightly. "It's still rough in parts. The middle section needs work," and I rushed the coda. "It was perfect," I insisted, and though I knew nothing about codas or what constituted rushing in classical music terms, I meant it. "Play something else? Please." He did. For the next hour, Eli played pieces from his repertoire, occasionally explaining the history or significance of a particular composition. I moved from the sofa to sit in a chair closer to the piano, watching his hands dance across the keys with a dexterity that seemed almost supernatural. At some point, he started taking requests, laughing when I asked for that sad one you play sometimes around midnight. You're going to have to be more specific, he said. Sad at midnight could be half my repertoire. It goes something like. I hummed a few bars of the melody that had become my favorite late-night companion, and Eli's expression softened. Ah, Debussy. Clair de Lune. Good choice. And then he played it, his eyes closing at certain passages as if he were seeing something beyond the room, beyond the city, perhaps beyond time itself. It was during this piece that something shifted between us. Perhaps it was the wine, or the intimacy of the setting, or simply the emotional power of the music, but I found myself moved in a way that felt almost physical. When Eli finished and opened his eyes, looking directly at me with an expression that mirrored what I was feeling, I knew that this was no longer just a neighborly gathering. Would you like to sit here? He asked softly, gesturing to the space beside him on the piano bench. I could show you how to play a simple part. I moved to join him, acutely aware of the narrow bench that necessitated our sitting close enough that our shoulders touched. Eli positioned my hands on the keys, his fingers warm as they guided mine to the correct positions. He was patient as he showed me a basic pattern, laughing gently when I fumbled but encouraging me to try again. Music is about connection, he said, his voice close to my ear as we played a simple duet, his sophisticated left hand supporting my elementary right. It's about finding harmony between separate elements, notes, instruments, people. I turned to look at him, our faces inches apart. Is that why you play at night? To connect? His hands stilled on the keys. I play at night because that's when I feel most honest. When the world is quiet, there's nowhere to hide in the music. Every emotion comes through, whether I want it to or not. He paused, his eyes searching mine. I didn't know anyone was listening so closely. I've been listening since the first night, I admitted. It's been the best part of moving here. What happened next seemed as natural as the progression of notes in one of Eli's pieces. His hand moved from the piano to my face, hesitant at first, then more certain as I leaned into his touch. When our lips met, it felt like the resolution of a musical phrase that had been building since that first night I heard him play. The kiss deepened, and soon the piano was forgotten as we discovered a different kind of harmony. Eli's hands, so skilled at creating beauty from ivory keys, proved equally adept at drawing responses from me. We moved from the piano bench to his bedroom, the night unfolding in a series of tender discoveries and passionate crescendos that left us both breathless and amazed. Afterward, lying in his bed with the city lights creating patterns on the ceiling through partially drawn blinds, Eli traced lazy circles on my chest and told me about the first time he noticed me in the building. You were carrying in a box of books, he said. You had this incredibly focused expression, like moving those books was the most important task in the world. I remember thinking I'd like to know what books were worth that kind of attention. And now you know, I said, smiling at the memory of our first coffee shop conversation where I'd confessed my love for everything from classic gay literature to contemporary science fiction. Now I know, he agreed, pressing a kiss to my shoulder. I started playing louder after I saw you, you know. I hoped you might hear. You were trying to get my attention with Chopin? Is that so hard to believe? Musicians have been using their art to court admirers for centuries. Court, I repeated, amused by his choice of words. Woo then. Seduce. Whatever you want to call it. He propped himself up on one elbow, looking down at me with a mixture of affection and mischief. Did it work? Completely, I admitted. Though I think the in-person performance was what really sealed the deal. He laughed, the sound as musical as his playing. I'll have to remember that. Private concerts are apparently very effective. In the weeks that followed, our relationship developed with the same natural progression as that first night. Eli still practiced late into the evening, but now I was often on his side of the wall, reading on his sofa or sometimes just watching him work. I learned to recognize when he needed space to focus and when he welcomed company, even distraction. He learned that I wrote poetry, something I hadn't shared with anyone since college, and encouraged me to read my work aloud while he improvised accompanying music. The night of his audition arrived, and I waited anxiously in his apartment for his return. When he burst through the door, his face alight with joy, I knew before he said a word that he had succeeded. The celebration that followed, involving friends from his music program, several bottles of champagne, and eventually just the two of us tangled together in his sheets, remains one of my favorite memories of our early days together. Eli joined the chamber ensemble, which meant occasional tours and weeks away from home. But it also meant watching him perform on proper stages, seeing audiences respond to his talent with the same awe I had felt that first night in his apartment. During his absences, I would sometimes sit by our shared wall, remembering the time when his music was my only connection to him, marveling at how that tenuous link had developed into something so profound. Sometimes, people ask how we met, and we share the simple version, neighbors who connected over music. But the truth, as Eli likes to say, is written in the spaces between notes, in the quiet moments of listening, in the courage it took to knock on a door and ask for more, in the harmony we found together that neither of us could create alone. It's been 3 years since that first night I heard the piano through the wall. We've since moved to a larger apartment with better acoustics and more space for Eli's growing collection of music books and my expanding library. But sometimes, when he's practicing late at night and I'm drifting off to sleep in the next room, I'm transported back to apartment 3B, listening to a stranger's music and never imagining that the pianist next door would become the love of my life. The music still plays, but now I don't just listen through walls. I live within the melodies, a willing participant in the ongoing composition of our shared life. And when people ask Eli about his most meaningful performance, he always smiles and says it was a private concert for an audience of one, in a small apartment on a night when music bridged the gap between two people who might otherwise have remained strangers, separated by nothing more than a wall and the courage to ask for something more. Total_char_count, 18,767.